April 8, 1940. The Norwegian Sea, in thick fog and a heavy swell left over from days of storms. A British destroyer of 1,350 tons, separated from her squadron and searching alone for a man swept overboard 2 days earlier, emerges from the mist directly into the path of a German naval force escorting troops toward Trondheim. Within 2 hours, she will have exchanged fire with 2 enemy destroyers, launched every one of her 10 torpedoes across 2 separate attacks at a heavy cruiser 10 times her displacement, watched every last one of them miss, and, out of options, turned to ram the cruiser head-on rather than break off. She will lose her bow doing it, catch fire, and sink within minutes with more than 100 of her crew of 149, including a captain who drowns not from wounds but from sheer exhaustion after spending his last strength getting other men into life jackets rather than saving himself. The commander of the German cruiser she rammed will be so struck by what he witnessed that he will personally write to the British authorities recommending that captain for the Victoria Cross. The encounter happened because 2 unrelated naval operations, planned independently and in total secrecy, arrived in the same patch of the Norwegian Sea on the same morning. Britain had begun laying mines in Norwegian coastal waters under Operation Wilfred, intended to cut off the route by which Swedish iron ore reached Germany through the port of Narvik, and the destroyer HMS Glowworm was part of the escort screening the battlecruiser HMS Renown as she covered that operation.
On April 6th, in heavy weather, a sailor was swept overboard from Glowworm and she was detached from the squadron to search for him. She found no trace of the man and turned back on the 8th to rejoin Renown, running straight into a German naval force that had sailed the previous day as part of Operation Weserübung, the surprise invasion of Norway and Denmark that had begun without British intelligence detecting it in advance, an invasion that would eventually put German troops ashore at half a dozen Norwegian ports simultaneously, from Oslo in the south to Narvik far inside the Arctic Circle. The German ships Glowworm now faced, the destroyers Bernd von Arnim and Hans Ludemann, both packed with invasion troops bound for the same port, were themselves escorting the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper toward Trondheim to seize it. Bernd von Arnim opened fire first out of the fog, and Glowworm returned it immediately. The 2 German destroyers, unwilling to risk their troop-laden decks in a prolonged gun duel, turned away and radioed for help, a call Admiral Hipper answered within the hour. Naval doctrine offered a lone destroyer facing a force built around a heavy cruiser exactly one sensible option: break contact under smoke, report the sighting, and let heavier ships handle it later. A cruiser of Admiral Hipper's class existed for precisely this purpose, to brush aside anything the size of a destroyer, while remaining a serious threat to cruisers and even battleships of her own generation. On paper, there was no version of a fight that ended well for Glowworm. Her 4.7-inch guns were outranged and outweighed by Admiral Hipper's 8 8-inch guns by a wide margin, and her own displacement of 1,350 tons stood against a cruiser of roughly 14,000, more than 10 times her weight, a ship built specifically to shrug off destroyer-scale gunfire while dismantling it in return. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop, a career destroyer officer in his mid-30s, had every doctrinal justification to run the moment Admiral Hipper appeared. Instead, he held his ground. When Admiral Hipper appeared out of a rain squall shortly before 10, Roop immediately ordered smoke laid to cover his ship and got off the sighting signal that mattered most, then used the smokescreen to mount 2 separate torpedo attacks, firing all 10 of Glowworm's torpedoes between them, spreads that would have crippled or sunk most ships of the era if even one had connected. None did. Hipper's captain, Helmuth He, kept his cruiser's bow pointed directly at the incoming destroyer throughout both approaches, presenting the narrowest possible target and letting every torpedo pass harmlessly to either side. Glowworm, meanwhile, was taking the full weight of Hipper's main and secondary armament in return, her upper deck swept by 8-inch and 4.1-inch fire until only a single gun still worked, served by Petty Officer Walter Scott's crew, who managed one more hit on the cruiser at a range of barely 400 yards before that gun too fell silent. With his torpedoes spent, his guns wrecked, and his ship already burning, Roop had nothing left to threaten a 14,000-ton cruiser with, except the one thing left aboard a sinking destroyer that still moved, her own hull. He gave the order to stand by to ram, turned hard to starboard, and drove Glowworm's bow into Admiral Hipper amidships, near her anchor. Hipper, slow to answer her helm at the last moment as she tried to turn away, took the impact almost directly. Glowworm's bow sheared off on contact, and the rest of her hull scraped down the length of the cruiser's side, tearing open several holes below the waterline, wrecking a forward torpedo mounting, and flooding roughly 500 tons of seawater into compartments before German damage control parties could seal them off.
If a captain choosing to ram rather than retreat in a fight he had no realistic chance of surviving is the kind of naval history that keeps you coming back to this channel, subscribing costs nothing and brings the next one straight to you. Glowworm drifted clear of the cruiser, on fire, her forward magazines and boilers going up in a series of explosions at around 10:24 that broke her apart and sent her down within minutes, taking 109 of her crew of 149 with her. Admiral Hipper, mid-invasion, still carrying troops toward Trondheim and under no obligation to delay her mission for an enemy she had just defeated, stopped anyway and lowered boats to pull survivors from the freezing water, eventually recovering roughly 40 men, though several later died of their injuries, leaving 31, one officer and 30 ratings, to survive the war as prisoners. Roop himself was seen in the water helping other sailors into their life jackets rather than securing his own safety first. By the time a line was finally thrown to him from Hipper, he no longer had the strength left to hold on, and he drowned within sight of rescue.
Captain Haya, who had watched the entire action from his own bridge, was sufficiently moved by what he had witnessed that he later wrote to the British authorities through the Red Cross, recommending that Roop's conduct be recognized with the Victoria Cross, an almost unheard-of gesture from a wartime enemy commander toward the officer who had just tried to sink his ship, made all the more striking by the fact that Haya had no obligation to say anything at all about an action his own side had clearly won. Because so few of Glowworm's crew survived, and the full account only became available once German records and the recollections of British prisoners of war could be gathered after 1945, Roop's Victoria Cross was not gazetted until July 6, 1945, months after the war in Europe had ended, making it chronologically the earliest action of the Second World War to earn the award, even though it was among the last to be publicly announced, a 5-year gap between deed and recognition with almost no parallel among other Victoria Cross citations of the war. Admiral Hipper's own damage, while serious enough to cost her hundreds of tons of flooding and a torpedo mounting, fell short of putting her out of action. She continued on to land her troops at Trondheim on schedule, and the wider German invasion of Norway proceeded largely as planned, despite the delay Glowworm's stand had cost the force escorting her. That delay, and the sighting report Glowworm's radio room got out before she went down, were not nothing.
Her contact signal, timed 07:59 that morning, reached Renown, and from there the Admiralty in London, giving British commanders one of their first concrete indications that Germany was moving heavy naval units off the Norwegian coast rather than simply threatening it from a distance. Renown herself, together with the destroyer Greyhound, turned at best speed to intercept the reported German force, and the cruiser Repulse, the cruiser Penelope, and 4 further destroyers were detached from the main home fleet to support the area Glowworm had marked, though none of it arrived in time to prevent the landings that followed within days at Trondheim, Narvik, and elsewhere along the Norwegian coast, as Germany's wider seizure of the country unfolded largely on its own timetable, regardless of what one destroyer's radio room had managed to get out. Glowworm's action did not stop the invasion of Norway. It did confirm, hours earlier than Britain would otherwise have known for certain, that the invasion was already underway. None of what happened that April morning was decided by anything written on a specification sheet. On paper, HMS Glowworm was a perfectly ordinary, modern G-class destroyer with no business trading blows with a heavy cruiser roughly 10 times her size, let alone closing to ram one. What the specifications could not measure was a captain who held his position under fire long enough to get a warning out, who fired his last weapon knowing it might not be enough, and who spent his final minutes in freezing water saving other men rather than himself, so visibly that the enemy who killed him felt compelled to say so afterward. Admiral Hipper had been built to outclass exactly the kind of ship that attacked her that morning, and by every measure of tonnage, armor, and gun caliber, she did. She was not built to survive being rammed by one anyway, and she was certainly never built to have her own captain vouch, in writing, for the courage of the man who tried. A destroyer's specifications said she should have turned and run. Her captain's did not.